There are some people you meet only once, and yet, somehow, that one meeting stays with you for years. You may have known them for a few minutes, a few months, or a few unforgettable years. But when they leave, something inside you refuses to accept that the story is finished. You continue living. You meet other people. You change cities. You build a career. You become older. You tell yourself that you have moved on. And yet, somewhere deep inside, there remains a strange feeling. Not necessarily that you must get that person back, not even that you are destined to marry them. Something deeper, a feeling that the encounter meant something, that their arrival in your life was not random, that perhaps the separation itself was part of the lesson. Ancient Indian spiritual traditions spent thousands of years asking questions like these. Why do certain people enter our lives with extraordinary intensity? Why do some relationships transform us while others barely leave a mark? Why do two people sometimes meet at exactly the wrong time? Why can love appear genuine and yet circumstances pull two people apart? And perhaps the most mysterious question of all, why would two souls who seem destined to find one another be separated before they are capable of truly recognizing one another? The Vedic and Upanishadic traditions do not give us a simple romantic formula. They do not explicitly teach the modern idea that every person has one predetermined soulmate waiting somewhere in the world. But they offer something far more profound. They describe a universe governed by karma, dharma, desire, attachment, rebirth, and the gradual evolution of consciousness. And through this framework, separation can be understood very differently. Sometimes separation is not punishment, sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes the person is not taken away because the connection was false. They are taken away because the people involved are not yet capable of carrying what that connection requires. This is where the ancient idea becomes uncomfortable, because perhaps the universe does not always separate people to end a relationship. Perhaps it sometimes separates them to end the versions of themselves that would have destroyed it. Think about that. Perhaps you met someone before you were ready to meet them. Perhaps you loved them with the consciousness you had at that time. Perhaps they loved you with the consciousness they had. And perhaps both of you were carrying wounds, desires, fears, attachments, ambitions, and karmic tendencies that made a lasting union impossible. So life created distance, not necessarily because the bond had no meaning, but because something inside both people still had to change. The ancient Indian worldview begins with a radical idea. You are not merely the personality you see in the mirror. The body changes, the mind changes, emotions change, relationships change, even your identity changes. But the deepest self, the Atman, is not born in the ordinary sense and does not perish when the body dies. The Bhagavad Gita expresses this through one of its most famous teachings. The self is not destroyed when the body is destroyed. The body undergoes transformation while the deeper self continues its journey. And if consciousness continues beyond one lifetime, then the story of human relationships becomes much more complicated, because the people who enter our lives may not be appearing for the first time in the deeper history of consciousness. This does not mean we should assume that every powerful attraction is evidence of a past life romance. The Vedic tradition is much more subtle than that. Karma is not simply a cosmic dating system. It is the law of cause and consequence operating through action, intention, desire, and consciousness. Every action leaves an impression. Every attachment can create another attachment. Every unresolved desire can influence future experience. And this is where relationships become spiritually significant. Because human beings do not simply interact, we imprint one another. A person can change the direction of your life with a single conversation. A betrayal can alter your personality. A teacher can awaken a capacity that had remained dormant. A parent can give you a wound that takes decades to understand. And a person you love can force you to confront parts of yourself that you would never have faced alone. In this sense, relationships become mirrors. They reveal what is inside us, and sometimes the person who awakens us is not the person who stays. That distinction is extremely important because modern culture teaches us to measure love by permanence. If someone stayed, we say the relationship was real. If they left, we say it failed. But ancient Indian philosophy asks a different question. What did the relationship awaken? What did it teach? What attachment did it expose? What karma did it bring to the surface? What did you become because you encountered this person? That is a completely different way of understanding love, and it changes the meaning of separation. Imagine two souls, or more precisely, two individual streams of embodied consciousness coming into contact. Each carries tendencies from previous actions. Each has desires. Each has unfinished lessons. Each is moving according to a mixture of karma and free choice. They meet. Something powerful happens, but their lives are not empty pages. They have obligations, family responsibilities, dharma, personal growth, consequences from earlier actions, and sometimes their paths cannot immediately merge, so they separate. The modern mind calls this heartbreak. The spiritual perspective might call it karma unfolding. But there is another possibility. The separation itself becomes the teacher. This is the first secret. The distance between two people can sometimes reveal what their closeness concealed. When someone is beside you, you may think you love them. But do you love them? Or do you love the security they provide? Do you love their presence? Or do you fear their absence? Do you want their freedom? Or do you want their attention? Do you see them as a soul, or as something you believe belongs to you? The ancient teachings repeatedly warn about attachment because attachment binds consciousness. The problem is not love. The problem is clinging. There is an enormous difference between saying, "I love you," and saying, "I cannot be whole without you." The first can arise from fullness. The second can arise from dependence. And separation exposes the difference. When the person disappears, everything you were using them to provide becomes visible. Your fear becomes visible, your insecurity becomes visible, your loneliness becomes visible, your expectations become visible, your need for validation becomes visible, and suddenly the relationship becomes a mirror. This may be why some connections feel almost unbearably intense. They are not merely giving you pleasure, they are activating everything you have avoided. That is why the loss of certain people can feel much larger than the length of the relationship would logically suggest. You are not only grieving the person, you are grieving the version of yourself that existed around them. You are grieving the future you imagined. You are grieving possibilities that never happened. You are grieving the identity you built around the relationship. And sometimes, beneath all of that grief, there is another layer. Transformation. The person leaves, but something they awakened remains. You become more courageous, more self-aware, more disciplined, more compassionate, more spiritual, more honest. And this is where the concept of karma becomes powerful. Karma is not simply what goes around comes around. In the deeper Indian philosophical traditions, karma is connected to action and its consequences. But karma also interacts with samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. As long as consciousness remains bound by ignorance, desire, and attachment, the cycle continues. This means that life is not simply a sequence of random events. It is a field in which consciousness encounters the consequences of its tendencies, and relationships are among the most powerful fields for this process. Why? Because nothing exposes attachment like another human being. Money can reveal greed, power can reveal ambition, failure can reveal pride, but love can reveal almost everything. It can reveal fear, possessiveness, jealousy, abandonment, ego, generosity, devotion, selflessness, and surrender. This is why ancient spiritual traditions often treated relationships as serious spiritual territory, because the person you love can become either an object of attachment or an opportunity for awakening. Now, consider a strange possibility. What if the reason you lost someone was not because you were meant to suffer forever? What if you needed to discover who you were without them? This is one of the most difficult lessons of spiritual maturity. You cannot build a sacred relationship from two incomplete identities demanding that the other person complete them. A relationship may bring companionship, it may bring joy, it may bring support, but no human being can become the permanent substitute for the self. The Upanishadic vision ultimately points inward. The deepest reality is not found by possessing another person. It is discovered by knowing the self. This is why separation can sometimes become a spiritual initiation. The person leaves, and suddenly you are forced to ask, who am I when nobody is choosing me? Who am I when nobody is validating me? Who am I when the future I imagined disappears? Who am I when I cannot control what happens? These are painful questions, but they are also transformative, because the spiritual path begins when the false answers begin to collapse. There is another reason two people may be separated: Dharma. This word is often reduced to duty, but its meaning is much broader. Dharma can refer to the order, responsibility, conduct, and path appropriate to a person and circumstance. Your life is not composed only of romantic desire. You have responsibilities, you have lessons, you have people who depend upon you, you have a path that may require difficult choices. The Bhagavad Gita itself is built around a conflict between personal emotion and duty. Arjuna does not want to enter a terrible battle because people he loves stand on the opposite side. Krishna does not simply tell him to follow his feelings, he forces him to confront Dharma. This is crucial, because sometimes what you want and what your life requires are not the same thing. And a spiritually meaningful relationship does not automatically mean that you are supposed to possess it. Sometimes loving someone means releasing them. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to turn another person into an object of possession. Sometimes two people meet precisely to learn this, and sometimes they reunite only after they have learned it. But there is an even deeper layer. The Vedic tradition recognizes that desire itself can keep consciousness bound. We want, we grasp, we achieve, we fear losing, we lose, we want again. And the cycle continues. A relationship can become part of this cycle. I need this person. I need them to love me. I need them to stay. I need the relationship to become what I imagined. The more tightly consciousness grasps, the more suffering it experiences. The Bhagavad Gita describes a chain beginning with contemplation of objects, leading toward attachment, desire, anger, delusion, and eventually the loss of discrimination. The lesson is not that love is dangerous. The lesson is that uncontrolled attachment can distort perception. You can love someone so intensely that you stop seeing them clearly. You see your fantasy. You see your projection. You see what you need them to be. And separation can destroy that illusion. When they are gone, you begin to see them as a person rather than as an answer to your emotional needs. This is why some separations feel like spiritual death. Your imagined future dies. Your fantasy dies. Your identity dies, and yet you remain. That is where transformation begins, because eventually you discover something terrifying and liberating. You survived. You thought your world had ended, but morning came. You continued breathing. You went to work. You ate. You slept. You laughed again, and slowly the person who once felt like your entire world became part of your story. Not necessarily meaningless, not necessarily forgotten, but integrated. This is what spiritual growth often looks like, not erasing the past, integrating it. Now we come to the mystery of reunion. If two people are separated, does the Vedic tradition guarantee they will reunite? No. We should be careful here. There is no universal Vedic law stating that every two soulmates must eventually find each other again in the same lifetime. That idea belongs more to modern spiritual interpretation than to a simple Vedic doctrine. But the ancient traditions do give us a framework in which relationships can continue across lifetimes through karma and samsara. And that creates a fascinating possibility. A connection can continue influencing consciousness even after physical separation, not because two souls are romantically chained together forever, but because actions create consequences, intentions create impressions, attachments create tendencies, and unresolved patterns can continue until they are understood. Imagine two people who spend one lifetime repeatedly choosing fear over honesty. They separate, they move on, but the deeper tendencies remain. In another circumstance, similar emotional patterns may emerge again. The people may or may not be the same. The external story may be completely different, but the lesson can return. This is one way to understand karmic continuity. The universe does not necessarily repeat the same story. It repeats the lesson until consciousness changes. That is a very different concept from romantic destiny, and it is far more profound, because it means the purpose of reunion is not simply we finally got the person we wanted. The deeper purpose would be we finally became different people. Perhaps that is why timing matters so much. Two people can be compatible in affection, but incompatible in consciousness. They can care deeply for one another and still destroy one another. They can meet too early. They can meet while one person is emotionally unavailable. They can meet while both are trapped in old patterns. They can meet while their lives are moving in opposite directions, and sometimes years later, after extraordinary transformation, they encounter one another again. The difference is not necessarily that fate changed. The difference may be that consciousness changed. The person who once ran from vulnerability may now be capable of honesty. The person who once needed control may now understand surrender. The person who once demanded constant reassurance may now possess inner stability. The person who once treated love as possession may now understand love as freedom. Then something extraordinary can happen. The same two people can meet, but they are no longer the same people. This is the second secret. Sometimes reunion requires the death of the identities that first met. You cannot reunite with someone while remaining exactly who you were when you separated. At least, not if the separation happened because of deep unresolved patterns. If nothing changes, the same relationship usually reproduces the same problem, the same jealousy, the same fear, the same silence, the same avoidance, the same arguments, the same ending. This is why time alone does not heal everything. Time creates distance. Awareness creates transformation. You can spend 10 years away from someone and remain exactly the same person. Or you can spend 1 year confronting yourself and become almost unrecognizable. The spiritual path is not measured by the number of years that pass. It is measured by the consciousness that develops. This brings us to one of the deepest teachings associated with the Upanishadic tradition. The person who knows the self begins to see reality differently. Instead of constantly asking, "What can I get?" the question becomes, "What is real?" Instead of, "How can I make this person stay?" The question becomes, "What does love require?" Instead of, "Why did the universe take them from me?" The question becomes, "What is this experience revealing about me?" That shift changes everything. Because when consciousness changes, suffering becomes information. Every loss becomes a teacher. Every attachment becomes a mirror. Every separation becomes an invitation to discover what cannot be taken away. And perhaps that is the hidden reason some people are removed from our lives, not because they were unimportant, but because we had made them too important. We had placed upon them a responsibility no human being could carry. We expected another person to give us identity, purpose, wholeness, security, meaning, and life had to take them away long enough for us to discover that these things could not permanently come from another human being. The person was not necessarily the problem. Our attachment was. This is why spiritual traditions distinguish between the self and everything that comes and goes. Bodies come and go, relationships come and go, emotions come and go, thoughts come and go. But awareness itself is deeper. And the more deeply you recognize this, the less desperate your love becomes. You can love without possessing. You can miss without collapsing. You can grieve without becoming permanently defined by grief. And you can reunite without believing that the other person is the source of your existence. That is mature love. And perhaps that is the only kind of love capable of surviving separation. So, if you are currently experiencing a separation from someone who changed your life, do not immediately conclude that the story has failed. But also, do not immediately conclude that the universe has promised their return. Both conclusions can become forms of attachment. Instead, ask a deeper question. What is this separation asking me to become? Maybe you need courage, maybe forgiveness, maybe independence, maybe discipline, maybe self-respect, maybe spiritual maturity. Maybe you need to stop chasing someone who has chosen to leave. Maybe you need to forgive yourself. Maybe you need to release the fantasy of how things should have been. Or maybe you need to become strong enough that if life brings that person back, you can meet them without repeating the same patterns. Because perhaps the real reunion is not between two bodies, perhaps the real reunion is between two transformed consciousnesses. And that brings us to the threshold of the second part. Because if karma can connect people through patterns, if attachment can create bonds, if separation can become a spiritual teacher, then another question becomes unavoidable. What actually determines whether two people meet again? Is it destiny? Is it karma? Is it free will? Is it unfinished desire? Is it coincidence? Or is there something even deeper? And if two people really are connected across lifetimes, why would the universe allow them to suffer through separation at all? The answer may lie in one of the most misunderstood ideas in Indian spirituality. The purpose of life is not simply to obtain what we desire, it is to awaken. And sometimes the thing you desire most becomes the very thing that teaches you how to stop being controlled by desire. That is where the mystery of reunion truly begins. Because perhaps the universe is not asking, how can I bring these two people back together? Perhaps it is asking, who must these two people become before they are ready to meet again? And that question changes the entire story. Because sometimes the separation is not the end of the love story, it is the beginning of the transformation. Imagine that years have passed. The pain has become quieter. You no longer check your phone hoping to see their name. You no longer replay every conversation. You no longer ask why they left. Life has moved forward. You have changed. Perhaps they have changed too. And then, unexpectedly, you see them again. There is no dramatic music, no cosmic announcement, no voice from the heavens telling you that destiny has arrived. Just two human beings standing in the same place after years of becoming different people. And something feels strangely familiar, not necessarily because you remember another lifetime, but because something about the encounter reaches deeper than ordinary recognition. The question is, why? Why would life bring someone back after forcing you apart? And does reunion actually mean destiny? The Vedic worldview gives us an answer that is more complex than romantic fate. It begins with karma. Karma means action and consequence. But karma is not a simple reward and punishment system. It is more like a web of causation. Your actions shape your tendencies. Your tendencies influence your choices. Your choices create consequences. Those consequences influence future experiences. And through this process, consciousness moves through samsara. This means that relationships can have consequences beyond the immediate moment. A promise can shape a life. A betrayal can create patterns. A sacrifice can transform character. An attachment can bind the mind. An act of compassion can change the direction of consciousness. But here is where people often misunderstand karma. They imagine that karma says, you are guaranteed to get the person you lost. It does not. Karma is not a vending machine. You cannot put suffering into the universe and demand a specific reward. You cannot say, I loved them sincerely, therefore the universe owes me reunion. That is still attachment. Spirituality does not exist to make our desires inevitable. It exists to transform our relationship with desire. This is why the Bhagavad Gita's teaching on action is so important. You have a right to action, but not absolute control over the fruits of action. This principle becomes incredibly powerful in relationships. You can love someone. You can communicate honestly. You can become trustworthy. You can repair what you damaged. You can grow. You can make the right choices, but you cannot completely control another human being. You cannot command their feelings. You cannot force their timing. You cannot manufacture their awakening. And you cannot demand that destiny obey your preferred outcome. This is where genuine spiritual surrender begins. You do your part. Then you release the result. And paradoxically, this is often when the deepest transformation occurs. Because the moment you stop trying to force reunion, you become capable of genuine love. You no longer say, "Come back because I need you." You say, "If life brings us together, let us meet as whole human beings." That is a completely different consciousness. Now, consider the ancient concept of vasanas, deep-seated tendencies or impressions carried by the mind. These tendencies influence how we perceive and respond to the world. A person may repeatedly choose emotionally unavailable partners. Another may repeatedly fear intimacy. Another may constantly seek validation. Another may become controlling whenever they feel abandoned. Another may sacrifice themselves completely for love and then become resentful. These patterns can feel strangely automatic. You know what you are doing is hurting you, and yet you repeat it. Why? Because intellectual knowledge is not the same as transformation. You can know that jealousy is destructive and still feel jealous. You can know that attachment creates suffering and still cling. You can know that you deserve respect and still chase someone who refuses to give it. Spiritual transformation occurs when understanding penetrates behavior. And this is why separation can be so powerful. When the person is gone, the pattern becomes easier to see. You begin to ask, why did I behave that way? Why did I need their attention so desperately? Why was I terrified of losing them? Why did I abandon myself to keep them? Why did I confuse intensity with love? These questions are painful, but they are sacred questions because they turn your attention inward. The relationship stops being merely a story about another person. It becomes a story about consciousness. And this is one of the great movements of Indian philosophy, from the external world toward the inner self. The senses move outward. The mind follows. Desire follows the mind. And human beings become absorbed in objects, experiences, identities, and relationships. But the Upanishadic sages repeatedly asked us to turn inward. Who is the one experiencing all of this? Who is aware of the thought? Who is aware of the grief? Who is aware of the longing? Who remains when every identity changes? That inquiry eventually leads toward Atman. And when the self becomes the center of consciousness, relationships change. You stop asking another person to save you. You stop asking them to complete you. You stop treating their presence as proof of your worth. You can still love deeply, perhaps even more deeply, but the love is no longer desperate. This is why separation can sometimes prepare two people for reunion. Because reunion without transformation simply recreates the old relationship. If the old relationship ended because of insecurity, returning without addressing insecurity changes nothing. If it ended because of dishonesty, returning without truth changes nothing. If it ended because one person could not commit, returning without maturity changes nothing. If it ended because both people were trapped in ego, returning without humility changes nothing. Time does not automatically transform people. Conscious effort does, self-inquiry does, experience does, consequences do, and sometimes suffering does. This is why some people become profoundly different after heartbreak. The experience breaks open something that comfort never could. They begin reading. They begin meditating. They begin questioning their patterns. They begin taking responsibility. They stop blaming. They become more disciplined. They learn to sit with loneliness. They learn that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. They learn that love does not require self-destruction. They learn that attachment is not devotion. And eventually, something remarkable happens. They no longer need the person to return, and that is often the moment they become capable of receiving whatever comes next. Perhaps the person returns. Perhaps someone else enters their life. Perhaps the relationship becomes a memory. Perhaps the greatest reunion is not romantic at all, because the purpose of karma is not necessarily to return you to a particular person. Its deeper purpose is to bring consciousness toward understanding. This is why we must be careful with the phrase, two souls are destined to reunite. It sounds beautiful, but spiritual truth is often less comforting than romantic mythology. Sometimes two people are separated permanently. Sometimes their connection was real but temporary. Sometimes the lesson is precisely learning to let go. Sometimes the relationship was never meant to become permanent, and sometimes two people do reunite. But the reunion is not guaranteed simply because the connection felt intense. Intensity is not proof of destiny. Obsession is not proof of karma. Synchronicity is not proof of a cosmic contract. And longing is not proof that someone is your soulmate. The ancient traditions demand discrimination, viveka. You must learn to distinguish appearance from reality, desire from wisdom, attachment from love, fear from intuition, and fantasy from truth. This is where the story becomes deeper, because what if the reason you believe someone is destined for you is actually because they activated something unresolved inside you? What if the intensity came from familiarity with a pattern rather than familiarity with a soul? What if you were not recognizing your eternal partner? What if you were recognizing your own wound? This possibility is uncomfortable, but it is liberating, because it means you do not need to chase every intense connection. You can ask, does this relationship make me more conscious? Does it make me more truthful? Does it support Dharma? Does it reduce my attachment? Does it increase compassion? Does it make me more whole? Or does it make me anxious, obsessive, fearful, and dependent? These questions are far more useful than asking whether someone is your twin flame. The Vedic tradition ultimately points beyond romantic identity. The highest goal is moksha, the liberation of consciousness from bondage. That means even the most beautiful relationship is not the final destination. Another human being can walk beside you. They can teach you, love you, challenge you, support you, but they cannot complete the journey of liberation for you. You must awaken. This changes how we understand karmic relationships. Perhaps some people come into our lives because there is unfinished karma, but perhaps others come because they accelerate our evolution. Perhaps a person appears at precisely the moment when we need to confront something. And perhaps they disappear precisely when the lesson requires solitude. This is why the timing of certain relationships can feel almost supernatural. You meet someone when you are vulnerable, they say something that changes you, they open a door, then they leave. Years later, you realize the person was not necessarily the destination, they were the catalyst. This is an important distinction. A catalyst is not necessarily meant to remain. A teacher does not live inside your house forever. A bridge is not meant to become your destination. A door is not meant to be carried with you. Some people enter your life to open something, and once that opening occurs, the relationship may naturally change. This does not make it meaningless, it may make it sacred. Now, let us return to the possibility of reunion. Suppose two people have genuinely transformed. Suppose the old patterns have weakened. Suppose both have developed greater self-knowledge. Suppose their circumstances align. Could their paths cross again? Of course. But what would make that reunion meaningful? Not merely chemistry, not merely nostalgia, not merely physical attraction, recognition, freedom, truth. The ability to meet without demanding that the other person repair the past. Imagine seeing someone after years and realizing, I don't need you to apologize for my life anymore. That is freedom. Imagine being able to say, I loved you then, but I also understand why we could not remain together. That is wisdom. Imagine being able to meet them without bitterness, without possession, without fantasy. That is healing. And if both people have reached that place, something extraordinary becomes possible. They can choose each other again. Not because karma forced them, not because destiny dragged them together, but because two conscious human beings freely choose to meet. That is perhaps a much higher form of reunion. The first relationship may have been driven by attraction. The second can be driven by awareness. The first may have been, I need you. The second becomes, I choose you. Those words sound similar. They are not. Need can create chains. Choice creates freedom. And freedom is essential to genuine love. The Bhagavad Gita repeatedly emphasizes disciplined action, knowledge, devotion, and surrender. These paths can be interpreted as different ways of transforming the human relationship with the ego. The ego says, I must have this. Wisdom asks, what is true? Desire says, I cannot live without this person. Surrender says, I will love without trying to control the outcome. Fear says, what if they leave? Awareness says, whatever happens, I will remain rooted in the self. This is the consciousness that makes reunion possible without turning reunion into another prison, because there is a hidden danger in believing too strongly in karmic reunion. You can turn waiting into a religion. You can spend years refusing new relationships because you believe one person is destined to return. You can interpret every coincidence as a sign. You can excuse unhealthy behavior because you believe the connection is karmic. You can tolerate disrespect because you think suffering proves spiritual depth. That is not wisdom. The ancient teachings do not tell you to abandon discrimination. They tell you to cultivate it. If someone repeatedly harms you, spirituality does not require you to remain available to them. If someone chooses to leave, you cannot spiritually justify forcing them back. If a relationship destroys your dignity, calling it karmic does not make it sacred. Sometimes the karmic lesson is precisely to walk away. Sometimes the most spiritual act is closing the door. And sometimes, years later, you realize that the person you thought you were destined to reunite with was actually the person who taught you how to stop abandoning yourself. That is a reunion of another kind. You reunited with yourself. This is why the ancient metaphor of the self is so powerful. The deepest spiritual journey is not about finding another half. You are not literally a broken soul wandering around looking for the missing half of yourself. The Upanishadic vision points toward wholeness already present at the deepest level. The tragedy is that ignorance makes us search outside for what we believe is missing inside. We chase relationships, We chase status, we chase pleasure, we chase recognition, we chase success. And eventually we discover that none of these can permanently satisfy the deepest longing, because the longing was pointing toward something deeper, toward the self, toward freedom, toward reality, toward Brahman. This is why the ancient sages were so radical. They did not simply say, find the perfect person. They asked, know the self. Because when you know yourself at the deepest level, you stop approaching love from desperation. You can encounter another person as another center of consciousness, not as property, not as medicine, not as salvation, but as another being walking through the mystery of existence. That is where love becomes expansive rather than possessive. And perhaps this gives us the final answer to the mystery. Why would two souls be forced apart before they reunite? Because sometimes closeness would prevent growth. Sometimes distance reveals attachment. Sometimes loss exposes illusion. Sometimes solitude develops strength. Sometimes karma creates circumstances that interrupt a relationship so that deeper patterns can be transformed. And sometimes there is no reunion, because the lesson has already been completed. This is the part most romantic interpretations leave out. The goal is not reunion, the goal is awakening. Reunion is only one possible consequence of transformation. If life brings two people back together, they can meet again. If life does not, the transformation still matters. The love was still meaningful. The lesson was still real. The consciousness still evolved. And perhaps that is the true beauty of the Vedic perspective. It frees you from needing a particular ending. You can honor the connection without worshipping it. You can remember someone without waiting for them. You can love someone without possessing them. You can accept separation without calling it failure. And you can remain open to reunion without making reunion your identity. Because destiny, if it exists, does not need your obsession to make it happen. What is meant to unfold does not require you to destroy yourself trying to force it. Your responsibility is simpler. Live your Dharma. Purify your intentions. Understand your patterns. Release destructive attachment. Act with integrity. Develop compassion. Seek knowledge. Know yourself. And allow life to reveal what comes next. Perhaps one day you will meet that person again. Perhaps you will look into their eyes and realize that the years apart were not wasted. You will see that you are no longer the person who needed them to complete you, and perhaps they are no longer the person who needed to run. Then the reunion will not feel like two broken halves finally becoming whole. It will feel like two whole people freely choosing to walk together. And that is much more beautiful, because love that depends on possession is fragile. Love that survives freedom is powerful. There is another possibility, perhaps even more profound. Maybe the person you lost was never meant to return. Maybe the universe did not separate you so that you could wait. Maybe it separated you so that you could awaken. Maybe their purpose in your life was to push you toward yourself. Maybe they were the question, and your transformation was the answer. Think about every person who has changed you. Some stayed, some left. Some betrayed you, some supported you, some taught you through kindness, others taught you through pain. But each encounter became part of the person you are becoming. This is why the spiritual life cannot be measured only by what we gain. It must also be measured by what we become capable of releasing. You release control. You release resentment, you release fantasy, you release the demand that life conform to your expectations, and eventually you release the idea that your happiness depends on one particular outcome. That is freedom. And freedom is the direction toward which the highest teachings point. The Bhagavad Gita does not promise Arjuna that everything he loves will remain exactly as he wants. It teaches him to act with clarity despite uncertainty. The Upanishads do not promise that every attachment will end in possession. They point toward the knowledge of the self. And the broader Vedic worldview does not reduce existence to romantic destiny. It places every relationship inside a much larger journey of consciousness: birth, death, rebirth, karma, dharma, desire, knowledge, liberation. Within that enormous cycle, two people may meet, they may love, they may separate, they may reunite, they may never see each other again. But the deeper question remains: what happened to consciousness because they met? That may be the real measure of the relationship, not how long it lasted, not whether you ended up together, not whether people called it destiny, but whether you became more awake, more truthful, more compassionate, more free. And perhaps this is why some separations feel strangely sacred, because somewhere beneath the heartbreak you sense that something is changing. You do not know what. You cannot yet see the purpose. You only know that the old version of your life is gone. And when the old version disappears, the mind desperately wants an explanation. It asks, why did they leave? Why did this happen? Why now? Why us? But perhaps the better question is, what am I being asked to become? That question turns suffering into a path, and once you begin walking that path, something unexpected happens. You stop obsessing over whether they will return. You begin building yourself. You stop watching the door. You start opening your own consciousness. You stop asking destiny to give you a person. You begin asking life to give you wisdom. And perhaps somewhere along that journey, the universe surprises you. Maybe they return. Maybe someone else arrives. Maybe you discover a form of love you never imagined. Or maybe you discover something deeper than romantic love entirely. You discover yourself, the self that was present before the relationship, the self that remained during the heartbreak, the self that watched the attachment rise, the self that watched it fall, the self that remains. And this brings us to the final mystery. Perhaps the greatest reunion was never between you and another person. Perhaps it was between you and the part of yourself you abandoned while trying to be loved. That is the reunion no separation can prevent. And if two people truly are meant to walk together again, they will not need to meet as the same wounded versions of themselves. They will meet differently, with less fear, less possession, less ego, more awareness, more freedom, more truth. And if they do not reunite physically, the lesson can still remain complete, because the purpose of the journey was never merely to get the person back. The purpose was to become awake enough to understand why you loved them, why you lost them, and who you became because of it. So if someone has recently disappeared from your life, do not immediately call the connection meaningless, but do not worship the connection either. Let it teach you. If you love them, wish them well. If you hurt them, take responsibility. If they hurt you, learn without becoming bitter. If they return, meet them with awareness. If they do not, continue walking. Do not turn your life into a waiting room. The Vedic vision of existence is far too vast for that. Your life is not paused because one person left. Your karma continues, your dharma continues, your evolution continues, and the deepest self within you remains untouched by the rise and fall of human relationships. Perhaps that is the final secret. The universe may separate people, circumstances may change, bodies may age, relationships may end, lives may begin and disappear, but consciousness continues its journey. And somewhere within that journey, every meaningful encounter becomes part of the unfolding. Some people are companions, some are teachers, some are mirrors, some are catalysts, some are lessons. And perhaps a very rare few become companions again after both have learned what separation was trying to teach. So do not ask only, will they come back? Ask, who will I be if they do? And perhaps, even more importantly, who will I become if they don't? Because when you can honestly answer that question, you have already crossed the most important threshold. You are no longer waiting for another soul to complete your story. You are living your own. And if destiny brings someone back into it, you will meet them not from emptiness, but from wholeness, not from fear, but from freedom, not from attachment, but from love. And perhaps that is why some souls seem to be separated before they reunite, not because the universe enjoys taking love away, but because sometimes two people must first become capable of loving without losing themselves. Sometimes the distance is the teacher, sometimes the silence is the teacher, sometimes the loss is the teacher, and sometimes the person who leaves your life becomes the doorway through which you finally discover the person you were always meant to become. The ancient sages would ultimately ask us to look even beyond this, beyond the relationship, beyond the reunion, beyond the separation, beyond karma itself, toward the eternal self. Because perhaps every relationship is temporary, but the awareness experiencing all relationships is deeper than any temporary story. And once you begin to understand that, you no longer fear every ending. You no longer chase every departure. You no longer need every love to become permanent. You can simply honor what was, learn from what happened, act wisely in the present, and surrender the future. Because the deepest lesson of the Vedas is not that someone is guaranteed to return to you, it is that the journey of consciousness is larger than any one relationship. People may enter your life, people may leave, some may return, some may not, but your journey continues. And perhaps one day when you look back at the separation that once broke your heart, you will understand something you could never see at the beginning. You were not being abandoned, you were being changed. And perhaps the reunion you were waiting for was not simply the return of another person. Perhaps it was the return of your own soul to itself. That is the reunion that matters most. And once you understand that, you are finally ready for whatever comes next, whether they return or whether life leads you somewhere entirely different. Because you have learned the one lesson that makes every other lesson possible. Love deeply, live your Dharma, release what you cannot control, and never mistake another person's presence for the source of your own wholeness. That is where attachment ends. That is where freedom begins. And perhaps that is where the true journey of the soul finally begins. There is a strange moment that sometimes comes after heartbreak. At first, you think only about the person. You remember their face, their voice, the way they looked at you, the conversations you never finished, the future you imagined. You wonder whether they are thinking about you. You wonder whether they regret leaving. You wonder whether they will come back. But then, slowly, something changes. The questions begin moving inward. Instead of asking, "Why did they leave me?" you begin asking, "Why did their absence change me so much?" And that question leads somewhere much deeper. Because according to the ancient Indian understanding of life, relationships are not merely about companionship. They are also fields of karma. They expose tendencies. They reveal attachment. They challenge the ego. They force us to confront the difference between what we want and what reality is actually giving us. And sometimes the greatest transformation begins precisely when the person we thought we could not live without is no longer there. This is why separation can become spiritually significant, not because suffering is automatically sacred, not because every breakup is secretly a cosmic plan, and not because the Vedas promise that every lost lover will return. They do not. The deeper teaching is much more demanding. It asks, what are you becoming because of this experience? That question changes everything. Because perhaps the purpose of the separation was never simply to bring the two people back together. Perhaps the purpose was to transform them enough that, if they ever met again, they would no longer repeat the same story. And this is where the ancient concept of karma becomes essential. Karma is often misunderstood as a cosmic reward and punishment system, but the deeper idea is about action, intention, consequence, and the impressions those actions leave upon consciousness. Every choice has consequences. Every attachment influences the mind. Every repeated behavior strengthens a tendency. And those tendencies influence future choices. This creates a cycle. You think, you desire, you act. Your action creates an impression. That impression influences what you desire next. And slowly you become conditioned by the patterns you repeatedly create. Relationships can intensify this process because they bring our deepest tendencies to the surface. One person may carry fear of abandonment, another may carry fear of intimacy. One may constantly seek reassurance, another may withdraw whenever emotional closeness becomes uncomfortable. One may confuse control with love, another may confuse suffering with devotion. When these two people meet, their patterns can lock together. They may feel an extraordinary attraction. They may believe they have known each other forever. But sometimes what feels like destiny is simply two unresolved patterns recognizing one another. And that is a difficult truth, because intensity does not automatically mean spiritual compatibility. A powerful connection can be transformative without being permanent. Someone can enter your life and completely change you without being the person who remains beside you. This is why the ancient traditions place so much emphasis on discernment. You must learn to distinguish between desire and wisdom, between attachment and love, between intuition and fear, between genuine connection and projection. Because the mind can turn almost anything into destiny when it desperately wants a particular outcome. You meet someone, they understand you in a way that feels unusual, you become attached, then circumstances separate you. Instead of accepting reality, the mind creates a story. They are my soulmate. We are karmically connected. The universe will bring us back. Maybe, but maybe not. The spiritual path asks you to remain open without becoming attached to the conclusion. This is one of the hardest forms of surrender. To say, I do not know what the future holds, but I will become the person I am meant to become regardless. That is freedom. And freedom is central to the spiritual vision of the Gita and Upanishads. The Gita repeatedly teaches disciplined action without obsessive attachment to results. You act, you fulfill your responsibility, you give your best, but you do not control the final outcome. This principle applies directly to relationships. You can love someone sincerely, you can apologize, you can change, you can communicate, you can become more emotionally mature, but you cannot control another person's choices. You cannot force someone to return. You cannot force someone to love you. You cannot force someone to become ready. And perhaps this is why separation sometimes becomes necessary, because when two people are together, they can continue feeding one another's patterns. But distance interrupts the cycle. The person who always sought reassurance suddenly has to learn self-trust. The person who always avoided vulnerability suddenly has to confront loneliness. The person who depended on another person's approval suddenly has to discover their own worth. The person who tried to control everything suddenly discovers that some things cannot be controlled. This is painful, but it can also be transformative. Imagine a person who has spent their entire life believing, I am valuable only if someone chooses me. Then someone leaves. At first, that person's world collapses, but eventually they begin asking, who am I when nobody is choosing me? That question may be the beginning of spiritual maturity, because the answer cannot ultimately come from another person. Your deepest identity cannot depend on whether someone stays. Bodies change, relationships change, circumstances change, the mind changes. But the self described by the Upanishadic tradition is deeper than all of these temporary identities. This is the reason the sages repeatedly turned attention inward. They were not merely trying to make people feel better after heartbreak. They were asking a much larger question: what remains when everything temporary changes? And that question eventually leads toward Atman, the self, the consciousness beneath the change in personality, the part of you that witnesses thoughts, emotions, memories, desires, and fears. Once you begin identifying less with temporary experiences, relationships also change. You can still love, you can still feel, you can still grieve, but you no longer make another person responsible for your existence. You stop saying, you complete me, and begin understanding, you can accompany me. That distinction is enormous, because two incomplete people can become desperately dependent on each other. But two people who have developed inner stability can choose one another without turning love into possession. And this may be the real meaning behind the idea of reunion. Not two broken halves finally becoming whole. Two people who have discovered enough wholeness to meet without demanding that the other person complete them. That is a completely different kind of relationship. Now imagine the two people who separated years ago. They have both changed. One has learned patience. The other has learned honesty. One has learned independence. The other has learned vulnerability. One has released control. The other has released fear. Then, unexpectedly, their paths cross again. Would the relationship necessarily work? Not automatically, but now something has changed. They are no longer approaching each other from the same consciousness. The old relationship may have been driven by, I need you. The new relationship can become, I choose you. That is the difference between attachment and conscious love. Need says, stay because I cannot survive without you. Choice says, stay because we freely choose to walk together. The first creates pressure, the second creates space, and love needs space. This is why reunion should never be treated as proof that destiny has finally rewarded suffering. Suffering itself does not guarantee anything. A person can suffer for years and learn nothing. Another person can experience one painful separation and completely transform. The difference is awareness. What did you do with the pain? Did you turn it into resentment? Did you turn it into obsession? Did you turn it into endless waiting? Or did you turn it into self-knowledge? That is where karma becomes meaningful. The experience is one thing. Your response to it is another. You may not control what happened, but you influence what happens inside you afterward. And this is where the Bhagavad Gita becomes especially relevant. Its central teaching is not that life will always give you what you want. It teaches you how to act rightly when you do not know the outcome. That is exactly what relationships demand. You may not know whether someone will return. You may not know whether your relationship will survive. You may not know whether the person you love is meant to stay. But you can still act with honesty. You can still act with dignity. You can still act without manipulation. You can still love without possession. And you can still release without hatred. That is spiritual strength. There is another ancient idea that helps explain why certain relationship patterns seem to repeat. The mind carries impressions. Experiences leave traces. Repeated emotional reactions strengthen tendencies, and those tendencies can influence future behavior. This means that if you do not consciously transform a pattern, changing partners may not change the underlying story. You leave one relationship. You meet someone new. The face is different, the circumstances are different, but somehow the same fear appears, the same jealousy, the same insecurity, the same avoidance, the same conflict. Why? Because you changed the person beside you without changing the pattern inside you. This is why separation can sometimes be necessary. It creates enough distance for you to see the pattern itself. You begin to realize it wasn't only about them. There was something inside me that was waiting to be understood. Maybe it was abandonment. Maybe it was control. Maybe it was fear of rejection. Maybe it was the belief that love had to be earned. Maybe it was the belief that suffering proves devotion. Maybe it was the inability to be alone. Once you see the pattern, you have the possibility of changing it, and that transformation may be the real purpose of the separation. Because if two people reunite without transforming their patterns, they often recreate the same relationship. The names are the same, the chemistry is the same, the memories are stronger, but the unconscious patterns remain. And eventually, the same pain returns. This is why time alone does not heal. Time creates distance. Awareness creates healing. A person can spend 10 years away from someone and remain emotionally trapped in the same moment. Or they can spend 1 year deeply confronting themselves and emerge completely different. The calendar does not transform consciousness. Awareness does. This is why the ancient spiritual traditions emphasized self-discipline, meditation, knowledge, devotion, and self-inquiry. They were methods for transforming the mind, because a transformed mind experiences the same world differently. The person who once saw abandonment may eventually see freedom. The person who once saw rejection may eventually see redirection. The person who once saw loss may eventually see instruction. This does not mean pretending that pain was good. It means refusing to allow pain to be meaningless. And perhaps that is the greatest gift separation can offer. It forces you to become responsible for your own consciousness. Now, there is something important we must say. Not every separation is temporary. Not every karmic connection ends in reunion. Not every intense relationship is destined. And not every person who leaves is secretly coming back. This matters because spiritual language can become dangerous when it encourages people to remain trapped in unhealthy situations. If someone repeatedly disrespects you, you do not have to call it karma and remain available. If someone chooses to leave, you do not have to chase them. If someone harms you, spirituality does not require you to tolerate the harm. Sometimes the karmic lesson is precisely to walk away. Sometimes the soul's growth requires learning boundaries. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is release someone completely. And sometimes the relationship's purpose ends when the lesson ends. This is why the ultimate goal cannot be reunion. The ultimate goal is liberation, moksha. Freedom from ignorance and bondage, freedom from compulsive attachment, freedom from the belief that temporary things can provide permanent fulfillment. From this perspective, even a beautiful relationship is not the final destination. It can be part of the journey. It can teach you. It can soften you. It can challenge you. It can reveal you. But eventually, the spiritual path asks you to look beyond every temporary form, beyond the body, beyond personality, beyond relationship, toward the self. This is why the Upanishadic vision is so radical. It does not tell you to find another half. It tells you to discover the whole. The deeper self is not incomplete. The feeling of incompleteness comes from identification with temporary forms. And once you understand this, love becomes less desperate. You no longer need another person to prove that you are worthy. You no longer need them to stay so that your life has meaning. You can love them because you love them. Not because you need them to rescue you from yourself. And that may be the state in which genuine reunion becomes possible. Because if two people meet again after both have developed inner stability, the relationship no longer has to carry the burden of completing either person. They can simply share the journey. This is why sometimes a person returns into your life at a completely different stage. The first meeting may have been chaotic, the second may be peaceful. The first may have been filled with longing, the second may be filled with understanding. The first may have been driven by fear, the second may be driven by choice. The external people may look the same, but internally everything has changed. And perhaps this is what people intuitively describe when they say, "We met at the wrong time." Maybe there was nothing wrong with the connection. Maybe there was something unfinished within the people. Timing is not always about clocks and calendars. Sometimes timing is consciousness. Two people can be compatible in affection, but incompatible in maturity. They can love each other and still be incapable of loving each other well. That distinction is crucial. Love does not automatically produce wisdom. You can deeply love someone and still hurt them. You can deeply love someone and still manipulate them. You can deeply love someone and still be unable to give them what they need. Therefore, love must be accompanied by awareness. Otherwise, love becomes another name for attachment. This is why the spiritual question is not, do I love this person? It is, what does my love make me do? Does it make you more generous, more honest, more patient, more courageous, more compassionate, or does it make you controlling, obsessive, fearful, possessive? If your love destroys your ability to see reality clearly, then something has become distorted. The sages would tell you to examine the mind, because the mind can create an entire universe around a single person. You begin seeing signs everywhere. Songs become messages, numbers become messages, dreams become messages, coincidences become promises, every social media activity becomes evidence. And gradually, you stop living your actual life. You start living inside a story. This is not liberation. It is attachment wearing spiritual clothing. True spirituality makes you more grounded, not less. It makes you more capable of accepting reality. It teaches surrender without passivity. It teaches love without possession. It teaches hope without obsession. So if someone is meant to return, let them return through reality, not through fantasy. Let them return through their own free choice. Let the reunion happen naturally. And if they do not return, let reality speak. You do not have to spend your life waiting at a door that may never open. Your Dharma continues, your life continues, your growth continues, and perhaps the most extraordinary thing happens when you stop waiting. You begin becoming someone you respect. You begin living with purpose. You begin building something. You begin developing your mind. You begin strengthening your relationships with people who are actually present. You begin discovering peace. And one day you realize, I don't need them to come back anymore. That moment is enormous because you have broken the chain of dependency. You have stopped demanding that the future repair the past. You have accepted the present. And ironically, that is often the moment when the possibility of a healthy reunion becomes greatest, because now, if they return, you can choose. You do not have to accept them because you are lonely. You can ask whether the relationship is actually healthy, whether both people have changed, whether there is mutual respect, whether there is honesty, whether the connection supports Dharma rather than distracting from it, whether both people can remain individuals while sharing a life. This is conscious love. And perhaps this is the deeper lesson hidden behind the romantic idea of two souls reuniting. The reunion is not the reward, the transformation is the reward. The reunion, if it happens, is simply what may come afterward. Think about that. Maybe life separated you because you needed to become independent. Maybe the other person needed to become courageous. Maybe you needed to stop chasing. Maybe they needed to stop running. Maybe you needed to discover self-worth. Maybe they needed to learn vulnerability. And perhaps after both transformations, life allows your paths to cross again. But even then, you are not returning to the old relationship. You are creating something new. That is the difference. The old version is gone. The new relationship must be built consciously. And if it cannot be built consciously, perhaps the reunion itself becomes the final test. Can you love them without becoming attached again? Can you forgive without forgetting wisdom? Can you remain open without abandoning yourself? Can you choose them without needing them? That is a far greater spiritual challenge than simply getting them back, because getting someone back is easy compared with remaining free while loving them. Freedom is the real test, and this brings us to one of the deepest insights of the Vedic worldview. The universe is not necessarily organized around our preferences. We are part of a much larger order. We experience pleasure and pain, gain and loss, union and separation, praise and blame. The Gita teaches steadiness amid these opposites, not because emotions are forbidden, but because consciousness must become larger than the temporary experience. If someone arrives, welcome them. If someone leaves, grieve honestly. If someone returns, meet them consciously. If they do not, keep walking. This is not emotional detachment in the sense of becoming cold. It is freedom from slavery to outcomes. And perhaps that is the deepest form of love, to love someone while allowing reality to remain reality. No manipulation, no force, no fantasy, no spiritual excuses, just truth. So if there is someone you still think about, someone who disappeared from your life, someone you believe you were meant to meet, perhaps do not ask the universe to bring them back tonight. Ask something else. Ask, what did this person awaken in me? Then ask, what part of me still needs to grow? And finally, if we ever meet again, who do I want to be when that happens? Those questions can transform your entire life, because perhaps the universe is not preparing the other person for you. Perhaps it is preparing you for yourself. And if the two of you are ever brought together again, let the reunion happen from that place. Not from desperation, not from fantasy, not from fear, from awareness, from freedom, from mutual choice. And if the reunion never comes, let the transformation remain. Because the deepest journey was never about possessing another person. It was about becoming conscious, becoming whole, becoming capable of loving without losing yourself. And perhaps when you finally understand that, you will look back at the separation differently. You will remember the person. You will remember the pain. You will remember the nights when you thought the story was over. But you will also remember what happened afterward. You became stronger. You became wiser. You learned to be alone. You learned to forgive. You learned to let go. You learned that love can be real even when it does not become permanent. And perhaps that is the final secret. Some people are not sent into your life to stay forever. Some are sent to awaken something. Some arrive to teach you. Some arrive to challenge you. Some arrive to expose your deepest attachments. Some arrive to remind you of a possibility you had forgotten. And some may return after years of separation. But none of them are the source of your deepest wholeness. That belongs to the self. So do not spend your entire life asking whether someone will return. Become the person who will be okay either way. Because when you reach that state, you have already won. If they return, you can love them freely. If they do not, you can continue freely. Either way, you are no longer imprisoned by the outcome. And perhaps that is what the ancient sages were pointing toward all along. Not a promise that destiny will give you the person you desire, but a path toward becoming free from the fear of losing anything temporary, because everything in the visible world changes. Bodies change, circumstances change, relationships change, lives change. But the deepest self is not measured by any of these temporary events, and once you begin to recognize that self, the meaning of love changes. You stop saying, "Without you, I am nothing," and begin saying, "I am whole, and I choose to walk beside you." That is not a smaller love, it is a greater one, because it contains freedom. And perhaps, if two people are ever destined to meet again, that is the kind of love that can finally hold them together. Not because karma forces them, not because fate chains them, not because they are incomplete without each other, but because two conscious beings, after walking through separation, suffering, growth, and self-discovery freely choose the same path again. And if that happens, the reunion is no longer the beginning of the story. It is the evidence of everything they became while they were apart. So if you are separated from someone right now, remember this. Do not put your life on hold. Do not turn longing into worship. Do not mistake obsession for intuition. Do not confuse suffering with destiny. Instead, live, learn, grow, fulfill your Dharma, become stronger, become wiser, become kinder, become free. And if your paths cross again, let the person meet the version of you that emerged from the journey. Not the person who begged them to stay, not the person who feared being alone, not the person who needed their love to feel worthy, but the person who discovered something deeper. That love can be profound without being possessive. That separation can be painful without being meaningless. That destiny does not require obsession, and that sometimes the greatest reunion of all is the moment you finally return to yourself. Maybe that is why two souls are separated before they reunite, not because love was rejected, but because consciousness needed to evolve, not because the universe wanted to punish them, but because attachment needed to loosen. Not because the story was ending, but because the people inside the story were changing. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether they will meet again. It is this: who will they be when they do? Because sometimes the distance between two people is measured in miles, but sometimes it is measured in consciousness. And when that consciousness changes, the distance disappears. Whether the two people physically reunite or not, something essential has already happened. They have awakened. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson the ancient Indian sages left behind. Do not chase the person. Understand the lesson. Do not worship the connection. Understand yourself. Do not demand the reunion. Become ready for whatever truth comes next. Because when you stop trying to control the ending, you finally become free to live the story. And perhaps that is where the journey of the soul was leading you all along, not toward another person, but toward awakening.